Hi, everyone. Morning. So we're going to move from one Tory skipfire to another. We obviously had earlier in the week, Suella Braverman was the big thing. Last week, Suella Braverman decided to cause an immense amount of trouble for the Conservative Party, for Rishi Sunak. Then we had these leaks, which I think either Sunak or someone close to Sunak was behind, because I think it's a little bit of a coincidence that it took several days for Sunak to decide there was no need for an investigation after another leak, and that now, those leaks have stopped, which means the campaign against Braverman stopped. I think, as I said at the weekend, I think it's Sunak's gone to Braverman and gone, oh, this is a bit awkward. I'm getting a lot of calls to sack you, Suella. I'd like to protect you. Of course, I'd like to protect you. But you've been, off the rails a little bit recently. How about you behave yourself and I'll protect you? You know what I mean? So it looks like we'll see what happens the next time Braverman steps out of line, what Sunak does. But, for now, it might be that she's decided to wind her neck in. But we've segued to Boris Johnson. I'd be curious to know how the Braverman thing would have gone. If Sunak just says there's no need for an investigation, would people have gone, hang on a minute, I think there is. But Boris Johnson has come onto the scene, and he's throwing a wobbly now. And ultimately, he's throwing a wobbly because he can't stop happening what's happening. He's basically handed over evidence of his own criminality that we didn't know about, we probably suspected, but didn't know about. And now he's thrown a hissy fit, and he's sacked all his government-appointed lawyers, because that's the problem. These lawyers, because they work for the government, had to hand over all their materials to the government, the Cabinet Office, who checked through it. And so now he's saying, well, I've sacked all my lawyers. I'm not having those lawyers. I'm having my own lawyers, more expensive lawyers. And he still expects the taxpayer to front the bill for that. So there are now calls for Sunak to go, well, hang on a minute. Actually, Rishi Sunak should not pay him anymore. He should... people keep pointing out Boris Johnson's not even eligible for legal aid, let alone this level of legal aid. He earns too much. So Rishi Sunak should say no. But certainly what people are saying, Rishi Sunak should at least cap the amount Boris Johnson can spend, because he'll be engaging much more expensive lawyers. And I think Rishi Sunak should cap it. I think he should cap it at zero, because, it's absolutely ridiculous. And they're still blaming the officials for handing over the evidence. Note that I haven't seen any of Johnson's supporters try to downplay these parties, because they can't. The work ones, they could try and downplay it and say, well, okay, but they were working. Maybe it wasn't the right thing, but they were working. They were working very hard, difficult circumstances. I had a comment recently saying, oh, it's not like working in B&Q accounts department, but they can't do that with a party at Chequers or Downing Street, which involves friends and family, because that's a purely social event. So they're attacking the civil servants instead. But before I go on to Boris Johnson's death throes, there was another little bit of intrigue last night. I say intrigue, it was just more funny. So on Sky News, they leaked some WhatsApp messages amongst Tory MPs. Now, this keeps happening every now and then. This keeps happening. You keep getting Tory MPs in private WhatsApp messages, and then someone leaks it to the media, which they shouldn't do. They should. That's not on. It's funny for us because we're not Tories, but most of us may not be. But this is what was leaked last night. Now, they're talking about all this stuff coming out that's very damaging for the Conservative Party. I'm going to read it all because it's funny and it's not that long. So Jackie Doyle Price says, FFS, who on earth is spouting this bonkersness? Oh, yeah, the quality of their English is very poor. I should warn you, they're not very educated, Tories. Who on earth is spouting this bonkersness? Are you determined to turn our party into a skip fire? That term's catching on this week. Anne-Marie Trevelyan says what Jackie said. Sally Ann Hart says WTF. Kevin Foster says spot on, Jackie. Simon Hoare says, would the last Tory MP to leave the building please turn off the lights? The nonsense self-destroying crap has to end or our party dies. James Sunderland then says, These emerging groups, leaks and briefings to the media are helping none of us. All of us belong to the most successful political grouping ever. It's called the Conservative Party. At which point, Andrea Jenkins weighs in and she says, I don't like leakers. I prefer to say things to people's face. However, it is interesting. Some of those commenting were happy to speak out publicly against the Boris and Liz administrations. So maybe less sanctimony and hypocrisy. Clearly, many in the party are unhappy, but those at the top are not doing anything about this to bring people together. Robert Goodwill says this is an absolute skip fire of a sentence as well, but I know what he means. There are two very simple rules that must be applied in all situations. One, does what I say or do make it more or less likely that we'll win the general election? If the answer is yes, then do it. If not, then don't. And two, off the record briefings, see above. What he means basically is, and this is what I've said. I mean, I say this about Labour MPs, but the same applies to any party's MPs. What he's essentially saying, although he made an arse of it, is that as an MP, it is your job to get the party to win the next election. And so you have to always consider, despite your private politics, is what you're doing helping or hindering that process? If it's hindering, you shouldn't do it, is what he's saying, which is fair enough. Then Craig McClinley finally says, good advice, never do blue on blue, no matter how annoyed one might be. Now, I'll tell you what I find funny about this. Because what they're saying is perfectly reasonable. They're attacking, they're bemoaning the fact that these briefings are not helping. It's against, it's infighting. It doesn't help them. It harms all of them, is what they're saying, which is fine. Andrea Jenkins sticks the boot in by going, well, actually, you all deserve it because you were very nice to the other ones. And she's having a pop at Rishi Sunak as well. But I'll tell you what I find hilarious about it. They're complaining about people leaking things to the media. Well, I know about this because it was leaked to the media. So they're having a conversation about leaking to the media. And there must have been someone there basically going, as they were screenshotting it and getting ready to send it to Sam Coates of Sky News. Absolutely ridiculous. Can you imagine what they'd have all thought later on? Because this came out last night. Do you think what they all thought on that conversation? Bloody hell. We're having a conversation talking about how damaging it is to the Conservative Party to leak things to the media, and the conversation's leaked to the media. Politics like a chess game with 6-year-olds. Anyway, back to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is throwing a proper wobbly now. So the latest, in terms of the damage he wishes to do, is his resignation honours list, which has supposedly got about 50 names on it now. It's absolute nonsense. Anyway, it's supposed to be ready. I think I saw in a report probably within the next 2 weeks. It's probably going in the next 2 weeks. And that then means by-elections. Now, the Telegraph yesterday were trying to say that if Rishi Sunak doesn't protect Boris, that the 3 MPs that Boris Johnson has nominated for peerages, the plan was that they would defer their peerages until after the general election. That way they didn't have to step down early and trigger a by-election. So they just step down for the general election and have a candidate replace them. So the Telegraph is saying, if Sunak doesn't protect Johnson, then those 3 MPs will just stand down now, triggering by-elections. It's all his fault. But this is rubbish for 2 reasons. First of all, this story came out last week, and actually it's got nothing to do with Sunak. The House of Lords Appointments Committee has gone back to Sunak and said it's not appropriate to defer them. Either they stand down when these peerages are offered from the House of Commons, triggering by-elections, or they reject the peerages. It says they can't defer it until after the election. So unless Rishi Sunak can persuade them otherwise, they are going to trigger the by-elections. So what the Telegraph have basically done is repurpose that story to try and claim that it'll be a threat to Sunak. Well, it's not, and Sunak knows that, so it's stupid like. But the other thing is, so out of the 3 MPs that Boris Johnson has nominated for peerages, by far and away his biggest fan, his supporter, is Nadine Dorries, right? So if any, and we know Nadine Dorries is a vindictive little cow, isn't she? So if anyone was going to threaten to do something awkward to Sunak if she didn't like the way he was treating Boris Johnson, it would be her. And yet she immediately tweeted about this Telegraph article that it was all rubbish, that not only has this, what was in the article, not been discussed amongst themselves, but that they weren't going to be doing it. And you just think to yourself, so basically what's happened here is the Telegraph. See, it was bad enough when I read the Telegraph article because I thought to myself that they know this is rubbish. They're printing it. Maybe Nadine Dorries has gone whining to them and they've decided to report it if it's serious, but it's absolute rubbish. But the fact that Nadine Dorries has just gone, no, this is absolute crap, just means that the Telegraph just made it up. They just completely made up a story with nothing to base it on. Because usually, obviously, their articles are very misleading. A lot of newspapers can have very misleading articles, but they usually base it on something and then just, what they do is they just extrapolate in a really weird direction, but they base it on something. So what Nadine Dorries is basically saying here is they're not basing it on anything. They've literally just made it up. But anyway, all right, go through some more comments before we carry on with the next bit. There's mention of the ABBA party at the number 11 flat. Well, that is certainly one of the ones the Met should be investigating now, because if that was in his diary, they now have to investigate it. I mean, I've got no real trust that the Met will do a proper job of it, but, 50. Maybe they should all be Tory MPs so he brings down the government. Yeah, it's not though. So one of them allegedly includes his father being given a knighthood. So when Andy Prager saying there, but Phil, what if some of them think that some time out of government would be good for the party? Sure, there are a couple of critical thinkers left. See, so the way I look at it is it's easy to think that, because we don't at all think that the Conservatives are being good in government. But if you're a Conservative, you will still believe that a dysfunctional Conservative government is better than a Labour government. Because if you don't believe that, you shouldn't really be in the Conservative Party. You certainly shouldn't be a Conservative MP. If I was an MP and I ever found myself believing that my party should go into opposition because it is actually doing more damage to the country being in government than the opposition would, if I ever thought that, then I would be resigning from the party, because you cannot, as an MP, think that of your party. If you do, you shouldn't be in that party. So no, I don't think Conservatives will think that. And apart from anything else, if they are critical thinkers, look at the landscape. What is going to happen when the Conservatives lose office? Are they suddenly going to come to their senses? Are they suddenly going to thought, right, we need to actually treat this seriously now? No, they're not. They're going to double down on the crazy. We can see that. All of this that's happened, the month of May, not Theresa May, the month of May has seen the Conservatives, ever since those local election results, lose their freaking minds. There was the Boris Johnson therapy support group, and then there was the NatCon with Suella Braverman and co giving speeches there. And then we've had all this leaking against Braverman in order for Sunak to apply some sort of discipline, because he hasn't got enough authority to do it in the normal way. And now we've got these, Boris Johnson being investigated for crimes using evidence that Boris Johnson handed over. Do you know what? It reminds me, there was a case some years ago in Germany. There was a German bank robber, and he thought he was clever. He thought, I'm not going to speak because they might identify my voice. I'm going to write down what I want and pass it to the bank teller so they can't hear my voice, right? And he left the bank. He robbed the bank, left the bank, and the police arrested him in his home. And this is because he decided to write his instructions to the bank teller on the back of a utility bill that had his name and address on it. So the police just waited for him at home. That's what Boris Johnson's done, except he's not going to go to prison. But that is ultimately what he's done. He's handed over there, and he must be absolutely spitting feathers over this, because a narcissist like him he's got to face reality now. He can't twist it. When he was prime minister, he would just, like at the moment, the COVID inquiry is saying, so Boris Johnson's threatening to sue the Cabinet Office for passing over his diary to the police, which obviously is a non-starter. Of course, he's not going to do that, stupid. That would actually just draw more attention to it and would mean a court would have to examine the diary entries. That would be absolute madness. But there's a more credible threat to the Cabinet Office because the chair of the COVID inquiry is suing the Cabinet Office for not releasing enough of Boris Johnson's messages, not his diaries this time, his WhatsApp messages and so on, although it might include his diary entries as well. So Boris Johnson's raging because the Cabinet Office has handed over some of his stuff to the police. Well, if the Cabinet Office resists, the COVID inquiry has the legal power to this evidence. They will go to court. The High Court will say the government has to hand it over, and that will be that. And here's another thing. Imagine where we're going to be in a year's time. So let's say we have a May general election next year, which I still think is eminently possible. And so then we've got a Labour government in a year's time, right? So this COVID inquiry is still going on. So let's say this COVID inquiry is still struggling to get information that it wants from the government. Well, we've got a new government now. So then the COVID inquiry says to the Labour government, right, we need a load of this evidence and we're sick of you blocking us, to which the Labour government will go, yeah, we're not going to block you. Have whatever you want. There you go. All the evidence you want. Then he'll have no control, because at the moment, what Boris Johnson's trying to do, he's trying to exercise control over the government because it's still, he's still got some support amongst the parties of that government. What's he going to be like when it's a completely different government? He's got already, it looks like he doesn't have enough support because he's not getting what he wants. Rishi Sunak isn't frustrating him as much as he could do, but at the same time, he's also, he's not doing everything Johnson wants him to do. It was quite funny as well, because there was another article. So it might have been the Telegraph again. I can't remember. But some right-wing shill was saying Boris Johnson's really upset because he's supported Rishi Sunak's government, and now this is the way he treats him. It's like, Boris Johnson has never supported Rishi Sunak's government. He's been attacking it from day one. He tried to organise a rebellion against Rishi Sunak's big achievement, like the Windsor Framework. Rishi Sunak, that was his big platform. Boris Johnson tried to sink it. What sort of support is that? Absolute nonsense. He's a child. He's just a man-child. Graham's just said the net migration figure just published, 606,000. That'll lose them some votes. Well, yeah, Reform UK will be out in force today. Reform UK will be out in force. So will Labour. Obviously, Labour were pricey in this yesterday with their immigration-related questions. But bear in mind, so there's two important. So, okay, if we're going to address the why net migration's going up, consider two things. First of all, someone made a really good point yesterday that we have to bear in mind, just because the net immigration is going up doesn't mean immigration is going up, right? Why might net immigration be going up because of Brexit? Because there's lots of people coming into the country. Bear in mind, hundreds of thousands of them are students. British university education is actually a growth industry, even with Brexit. Although Suella Braverman's put the kibosh on that. She has now limited foreign students for coming here studying, and which is actually going to cost the economy, because that is one of the very few growth industries we still have. But a lot of them are students. And the other thing to bear in mind is British citizens can no longer emigrate easily to the EU, because British people used to go to the EU to work or to travel and stuff like that, or to live and work. And that can't happen now. So what's happened is there may be increased immigration, but what there is reduced emigration. So that's why the net migration figures will look much worse. As I say, partly it's because university students, who then go back home anyway, most of them, vast majority of them. And the other thing is British British people cannot now just go and live and work in the EU. But lots from the EU can still come and live and work here. They need a visa, but it's easier to get it because we're desperate. You know what I mean? Might set up a crowdfund to buy an EU passport. Well, I think the EU are very upset at places like Malta just letting you buy one, in all honesty. So that may come to an end at some point. I need a Europe flag, as Graham have around the table. Where's the Europe flag? What? What's a Europe flag? You may not see it very easily because I've got my VCam on. It gets rid of things like that. But, you know, we've all got one. I've got a Union flag somewhere as well. Probably a lot of Brits coming back after getting kicked out as well. Yeah, I don't know how many. I mean, obviously, anyone who'd been living there before we left was allowed to apply for settled status. It's just that a lot of them, and I think a lot of them were probably gammons, where they didn't think they needed to do anything. And so, yeah, some have got kicked out. I don't know how many, in all honesty. Purity saying the only decent job I've ever had were in mainland Europe. Well, when I was very young, this is before the EU, but when we were in the EEC, when I was very young, one of the most popular shows, and I used to watch it, was a show called Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, which was about a group of English builders going to Germany to work, because that's, you know, so I mean, lots of the gammons in recent years talk about, oh, these Poles coming over here taking our jobs. Well, in the early 80s, we had a TV show about a load of British people going over to Germany and not taking their jobs because there were loads of jobs going. But, you know, very much about that. And you would have thought that would have fostered a greater appreciation of being able to sort of try. I mean, they would have been needing visas because that was before the single market. You know, but the idea is from the early 90s, 93, 92, 93, that the idea that you could just go and work in Europe, live and work in Europe. And now that's stopped. So, of course, that's come back quite a lot. Oh, my, you dear sweet summer child. Rob Reed Jones has just said, loved Auf Wiedersehen, Pet. Have recently watched it, and the newer series too. New series being 20 years old now. Yeah, I remember that. I do remember that one as well. And the actual Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, will be like 40 years old now, won't it? One angry pagan saying, thank you very much. What human migration is natural. Our history as a species proves this to be. The rights have been distracting the public from the class war with racism. Yeah, well, this is the thing that's most annoying to me, because Britain is a mongrel nation. You know, even our language is like, it's a mix. There's different, like, languages have different roots. Ours is a mixture of like Germanic and the sort of Latin languages as well, and all sorts of things. And we absorb cultures so readily as well. I mean, our national dish is basically curry now. You know, we, as a population, we're not, and I know it sometimes seems that this is not the case, but as a population, we really do assimilate very easily, very quickly. And I don't mean, and I know you've got the British immigrants living in Spain and they want their own little Britain, stuff like that. But, you know, we, as a nation, for a long time, we sort of welcomed a lot of people. Not everyone came here welcome. Admittedly, you know, when the Danes and the French invaded us, they weren't necessarily all that welcome, or the Italians. But, you know, in terms of like recent history over the last few hundred years, massive amounts of inward migration to Britain. Not as much as America, granted. And then America's also a hugely xenophobic country, and they've had even more, you know, inward migration. It's very weird. Very weird. Don't forget French Normandy, they affect English language. Well, that's why I said about the Latin language. The Latin, French is a Latin language. But I mean, there was a time in this country, of course, medieval times, where you had two different languages. You had English, and then the nobility spoke French, which must have been quite awkward trying to ask the servants to do anything. I don't know how that works, but never mind. I assume they used to speak both. But there we go. Right, before we descend into into discussing the origins of languages, I will just say, yeah, it is. I'm going to say one thing actually in support of the Conservatives amongst this Boris Johnson, or one Conservative at least, well, maybe two, over this Boris Johnson fiasco. So Boris Johnson is obviously, and his supporters are attacking officials for just doing their job, right? Now, this has been going on for too long, that, you know, that officials are being blamed because of political failures. But I am going to say this. The new Justice Secretary, now, you may not know the new Justice Secretary. I'm trying to think of his name now. It's Chalk, something Chalk. Even I haven't learned it yet. But he replaced Dominic Raab, okay? And he has said that the officials acted entirely properly. And we've been, for too long, we were used to having either an Attorney General or Justice Secretary abusing the rule of law. Alex Chalk, thank you. Abusing the rule of law, attacking lawyers, attacking officials who were just doing their duty. And now we've not only got an Attorney General who doesn't disgrace the legal profession, we've now got a Justice Secretary doing the same. So one thing I will say for Rishi Sunak, he has now made sure that the two law officers or the two main law officers in government, the Attorney General and the Justice Secretary, are now not tarnishing the legal profession. Oh, Gary DeSantis, thank you very much for that super chat. £20 there. There was no message then. But yeah, Johnson is now. Well, it was mentioned there about isolation. Johnson is now going to have to get used to the fact, first of all, he can't get everything he wants. And the thing is, as well, it's like, it's not just that he's selfish, he's a narcissist. And a narcissist creates a perception of the world that suits them. And what they really hate is being met with reality, because then it's all unfair. Everything's unfair. You know, Donald Trump, the most maligned president in history, because he collided with reality. He was, before he became president, he was rich enough, he surrounded himself with people who would say black is white if he paid them to. All of a sudden in politics, there are people who are telling you, no, what you're talking is a load of crap there. And then when he lost the election, he couldn't square that in his head either. He probably thought the election had been stolen from him. He probably genuinely thinks that. So Boris Johnson, similar thing. He's now having to face the facts that, because remember, he used to get really angry at Keir Starmer when he trapped him in lies in PMQs. He would visibly get angry because he didn't like people telling him that his perception of the world was wrong. They didn't like him holding up like a mirror. And so he's going to have to get used to the fact he can't get everything done he wants. He got used to the fact that Rishi Sunak is going to protect him in some ways, but not in others. That Rishi Sunak's not going to destroy the entire party or his own reputation to save Johnson. And then Johnson's going to have to get used to the fact that a lot of these inquiries and investigations are going to carry on after the next general election when Labour are in power, and then he's got nothing. He's got the media. The media will carry on, talking about a witch hunt, but the public are sick of it. So actually, those news media are really, all they're doing is pissing off some of their own readers, but they're certainly not changing public opinion. And he's just going to have to get used to the fact he's going to become more and more irrelevant. But I am going to say this is my final point on it. There's people delighting, and I'm going to do this for my noonday video. There's people delighting in the fact that Johnson's getting some sort of comeuppance. And I will just point out, just to be a killjoy, he's not. Think about what comeuppance Johnson is now facing. He's facing the fact that he's not going to be allowed to be prime minister anymore. Well, I'm not allowed to be prime minister. So from that point, it's not a punishment. Most of us aren't allowed to be prime minister. So that's not a punishment. He's been told that he can't just get the government to do whatever he wants. Well, neither can I. He's been told that he might have to pay a few more police fines. Well, boo-hoo, he can afford it. He's been told that he might become less well-loved by the public. Well, I'm not loved by the public. These are all things that all of us share. None of these are punishments. They're just the way we live our lives. The only difference is Boris Johnson He's not going to lose his mansion. He's not going to lose his millions in the bank. He's not going to lose the fact that he'll be able to keep going to America and making speeches to drunk businessmen for buckets of cash. The punishment for Boris Johnson is that he's going to fall back into relative obscurity and live a life of luxury. That's his punishment. And if that's a punishment, my goodness me. But there we go. Right, let's have a look at last few here. So has Trump overtaken Warren Harding as the worst US president? See, I'm less of an expert on US presidents than I am British prime ministers, but I cannot imagine there has been a worse prime minister than Donald Trump. I mean, I can barely imagine there's been a worse person than Donald Trump. But I cannot believe there's been a worse president. That would be grim, but I am not a historian. Ask Graham. Lord Dacre might try to defend him. There's no Lord Dacre. Paul Dacre is not going into the House of Lords. But it doesn't matter who ends up in the House of Lords in the next few years. Because I'll tell you another thing. Bear in mind, once Boris Johnson's resignation on his list done with, then it's time for Liz Truss. Liz Truss. What if Liz Truss makes another couple of Tory MPs Lords? My goodness me. Although that may drag on so long, it actually goes beyond the general election. But there we go, for goodness sake. But I'll read out comment here. Johnson drank champagne with his cronies while sons and daughters couldn't say goodbye to their mums and dads. Well, exactly. That is exactly it. Absolutely disgraceful. And again, Johnson's allies don't help him. I mean, what happened when these latest parties came out? His sister went, I went to them and there was no problem. It's like, you going to them is illegal. Jacob Rees-Mogg said, I went to them, and you could think, okay, well, he was a minister, that might have been on business. And I took my family and my son bowled Boris Johnson out leg before wicket, or middle stump, I think he said. Middle stump. So it's like, it's like the saying, with friends like these, who needs enemies? His own sister and one of his strongest supporters has basically admitted that he broke the law. Idiots. Anyway, last one angry pagan saying here, thank you very much. Cheers, liberals of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries for the stupid, harmful ideologies we have now. When will it end? I mean, I don't think it's really even too much of a hang up from those times. It's the fact that the Conservative Party, in whatever guise it's had, has constantly adapted to changing situations. So the way they changed to universal suffrage was to make sure they used the media. They bought up the media and used that to present their politics. In the absence of, because remember, we don't get educated about things like the economy or politics in school. So the state doesn't educate people about how things work in politics or the economics. So the media takes that place. Nature abhors a vacuum. In the vacuum of that knowledge, the media takes that place. And the media is owned by like 3 people, none of whom have got our interests at heart. But anyway, we'll call it there. Thank you very much for coming on. Have a very good day. And until next time, I will see you later.